where you see the passing of time.
The crowds in St. Peter's Square are praying like mad for the Pope's life.
Where moments refuse to die.
This is a momentous hour in world history. This is the invasion of Hitler's Europe.
And where victory lives on.
Plenty of girls are being kissed by plenty of boys they don't know, and they do not care.
You can love it, hate it, embrace it, or turn away.
Lenin was shot to death late last night outside his apartment building.
But it is a past we all share.
Come on out here and give me a salute. Big Navy salute.
This is where yesterday has a home, where we wonder what it was like back then.
Go forward, knights, in safety.
And not too long ago.
His spirit must live on.
It's where history has its place and where the past comes alive. The History Channel.
Ever since the quest to conquer the seas began, we arrogant mortals have endowed our man-made vessels with the godlike power to protect us. But time and time again, the oceans have proven where the real power lies. July the 17th, 1956. Under satiny morning clouds, the 1,706 passengers and crew aboard the Andrea Doria watched the port of Genoa, Italy, fade into the distance. It was the first day of the magnificent vessel's 51st voyage. Ahead lay 9 days of unbroken opulence and pampering, and her passengers were anticipating a restful journey aboard the finest of all modern luxury liners.
I had been working in Europe, in Munich, for 5 years. And we thought, well, this is a nice way to go home. A 9-day cruise to the Mediterranean, going to Naples and Cannes and Gibraltar and so forth, and it's a nice, relaxing way to go back.
Everything was just the very best. You know, it was the most modern, newest, most exotic ship you have ever seen.
This exquisite modern liner traced the roots of her creation to more innocent days before World War II, when Italian liners had reigned supreme upon the oceans. But after the savage battle for the Atlantic, Italy's fleet lay as decimated as her post-war dignity. And by 1949, there was a new competitor for overseas travel: airplanes. Faster, more comfortable, and more accessible than ever before. But Italy's shipbuilders had a plan: to recapture the transatlantic passenger trade by creating the most beautiful, most technically advanced fleet of new liners ever to cut through the waves. One of the first ships was to be named for the man who had won Genoa's independence from Spain, the father of Italy, Admiral Andrea Doria. A tribute to her namesake, the Doria was envisioned not only as the future star of the Italian line, but also as a symbol of the finest of her national heritage. By 1949, the Ansaldo shipyards just outside Genoa were alive again for the first time since the war. Immersed in the construction of the vessel that would embody all of Italy's hopes for the future.
The first years after the war, the Italian shipyards had no work. So Ansaldo shipyard that built the Andrea Doria, the workers for the first years that started to build ships without being paid because there was no money. A ship like that was the symbol of the rebirth of the Italian industry.
When she emerged from the shipyards 2 years later, the Andrea Doria was 697 feet long and weighed 29,100 tons. But she wasn't yet complete. The Italian line commissioned the best of the nation's artists, including Salvatore Fiume, to paint murals and design extravagant suites. Decorating the Doria's interior took another 18 months. When the work was completed, she was literally a floating art museum.
The Andrea Doria class went back to the old style, luxurious, gigantic old mansions, heavy carving, foot-thick wooden walls with magnificent pilasters and columns and everything like that, stained glass windows. The works, they had everything. One of the suites had a very amazing bathroom. So amazing, I've never forgotten it in my whole life. It was white, the whole bathroom, and on the white walls, floors, furnishings, everything were dark blue nautical symbols, even inside the toilet bowl. It was perfectly astonishing.
The breathtaking richness of the Andrea Doria was designed to convince travelers that a leisurely ocean crossing was still to be preferred over the shorter journey in an airplane. The Doria's appeal worked. For the wealthy and the famous who craved the specialized pampering and fuss only a first-class cabin steward could provide, as well as those faithful romantics for whom a relaxing ocean voyage was still the only way to travel.
There'd been a lot of recent accidents, and we said, you know, it'd be nicer and safer to go back by boat. Safer is the operative word.
In 1956, I was an Italian war bride. And after 2 years, I was coming to re-meet my husband. And I decided to take a plane. I don't want to take a ship. But then, the last moment, my family convinced me to take the ship.
Italian-born Liliana Duna was a part of another group of passengers for whom the Doria was expressly created. The newest wave of Italian immigrants to move to the United States. These passengers occupied most of the 700 spaces in the third or tourist class, which on a liner like Doria provided a level of comfort above anything they'd experienced at home. The Andrea Doria had the best of everything, from her splendid decor to her state-of-the-art engines and equipment. But that was only part of the equation. She would need a master who was a superior navigator, a captain who could pilot her to a myriad destinations in both a safe and timely manner. That man was Captain Piero Calamai, a decorated naval hero with 35 years of experience at sea and the descendant of one of Genoa's oldest and most respected seafaring families. Piero Calamai and Andrea Doria were inseparable from the day of her initial test run. With an expert's precision, he came to know every facet of the vessel's complex inner workings. Soft-spoken but revered by his crew, he was a working captain. That's to say, he far preferred his duties on the bridge in the company of his officers and men to the customary public relations and first-class socializing expected of a luxury liner's master.
He was a very brilliant captain. He was very elegant, the maneuver, but he was also timid, I have to say. But he was very good, very human.
After only a few voyages together, Calamai and the Doria began to prove true the mariner's adage that a well-tended ship often takes on the characteristics of her master. Both the Doria and Calamai were regal, distinguished, yet disciplined and efficient. On the morning of July the 17th, 1956, Captain Calamai stood on the ship's bridge and artfully guided Andrea Doria out of the same harbor that his seafaring ancestors had navigated for hundreds of years. But this particular departure was tinged with nostalgia. It was to be Calamai's last voyage as captain of the Doria, for upon his return to Italy, he was to be promoted to her newer sister ship, the Cristoforo Colombo. After leaving Genoa, the Andrea Doria glided gracefully through her commuter rounds of the sparkling blue Mediterranean, picking up passengers, cargo and mail at Cannes on the French Riviera, Naples in northern Italy, and British Gibraltar at the entrance of the Mediterranean. Aboard the palatial vessel, everything was running smoothly and on time.
The ship was like a city by himself. Very comfortable, very majestic. But I have a very strong mental telepathy. And I felt so uncomfortable, like something was going to happen.
In the icy waters 2,000 miles northwest of the Doria, another passenger liner was also making her way across the Atlantic toward New York. She was the Swedish-American line's Stockholm, and in beauty, size, and speed, she paled in comparison with her Italian competitor. Built for practicality rather than luxury, her most outstanding feature was her angular, steel-reinforced bow, designed to slice through the perilous North Atlantic ice floes. Perhaps the greatest difference between the Stockholm and the Doria lay in the divergent natures of their captains. Captain Gunnar Nordenson, though also a master mariner of 40 years' experience, was a strict disciplinarian who rarely fraternized with his crew. Tensions ran high aboard the Stockholm, where the meticulous Nordenson tolerated nothing less than perfection from his officers. In a matter of days, the destinies of these two very different men and their vessels would converge in tragedy over the cold, black waters off the Nantucket shoals. July the 20th, 1956. Under the glare of the Mediterranean sun, Captain Calamai weighed anchor at Gibraltar and set course for the open sea. Making the usual notations in his logbook, he accounted for 1,134 passengers, 401 tons of freight, 9 automobiles, 522 pieces of baggage, and 1,754 bags of mail. Now the North Atlantic stretched ahead for 5,000 uninterrupted miles. While Captain Calamai and his 572-man crew set to guiding the vessel safely across, the passengers looked to the impressive bounty of the Andrea Doria for their entertainment. The options were endless. Each of the 3 classes, even for the first time in history, the immigrants, had their own elaborately styled swimming pools. There were sports events, fine entertainment, and of course, wine flowed from bottomless casks, and rich, sumptuous food was always right at the edge of every passing waiter's tray.
The service was terrific. You can have anything you want. It was right there at your beck and call, and constant entertainment, of course. Or you could just sit in your deck chair or go swimming in the pool.
But neither the food and drink nor the priceless works of art were enough to satisfy all of the passengers. Bored with the company of his mother and little sister, 9-year-old Pat Mastrinkola sought his own brand of entertainment.
I was bored, so I used to spend a lot of time exploring different parts of the ship which I wasn't allowed to be in. I used to try to always sneak up into cabin class, and I would climb up poles on the outside of the ship. As soon as I got over the rail, there'd always be someone to go back down. It was like they were waiting for me.
On the 7th night of the crossing, a gale raced across the North Atlantic. There was little Calamai could do but reduce his ship's speed and push back her estimated time of arrival in New York by an hour. Squalls like this were a common occurrence on this unpredictable stretch of ocean, but Captain Calamai knew that a late arrival meant added costs, poor public relations, and a possible censure from his employers at the Italian line.
It was always a race for speed and size. The faster, the better. The Italian line just wanted to be in there with the finest.
The storm finally passed. Its only casualties, the handful of chalk-faced passengers suffering their first bout of seasickness. As the swells began to subside, life on board returned to normal. But down in tourist class, Liliana Duna, traveling only with her 2-year-old daughter, never lost her sense of foreboding.
I told the people in a restaurant at my table, I said, I dream of the ship sunken and somebody rescue me and my daughter. And they laugh at me. Things like they say don't happen no more, and they calm me down a little bit. And I eat my breakfast. The same night, I have the same dream. And when I went for breakfast again with these people, and I don't want to eat, I was a little shaky inside.
The confidence of Liliana Duna's fellow passengers was understandable. New York was a mere 2 days away, and the Andrea Doria had an elite hand-picked crew, the most advanced radar system available, and a perfect safety record. Thanks to the legacy of the Titanic disaster over 40 years earlier, the Doria was equipped with more than adequate lifeboat capacity for every person on board. Tranquil seas seemed to promise an uneventful arrival in New York on the 26th.
I remember going out on the deck. You could see the lifeboats, and I thought, geez, what a silly idea putting these out. This ship would never sink.
Approximately 900 miles away, on the 24th of July, the Swedish-American line's 12,000-ton Stockholm had already docked safely in New York Harbor. Her passengers, tourists and Swedish immigrants alike, disembarked, and the meticulous Captain Nordenson began preparing his crew for the return leg of the voyage. Professor William Johnson, then a struggling young student, was one of the new crew members welcomed aboard.
It was my first time on board ship, ever. I had no experience. My job was that of washing all the glasses. I was the formal glass dishwasher on board the Stockholm. I never had washed glasses in any professional way before. I learned how to do that in about 2 minutes, so away we go.
While the Stockholm prepared for her return journey to Sweden, less than 500 miles out at sea, the Andrea Doria eased her way toward the Nantucket Lightship, a floating lighthouse that served as the gateway to the bustling shipping lanes of the American eastern seaboard. But once again, the cunning North Atlantic had a surprise in store for her.
Nebbia, Capitano, nebbia!
It was said that Piero Calamai had a sixth sense about fog, that he could always feel it in the air. On the afternoon of July the 25th, his sixth sense was telling him that the patches of fog hanging low over the ship would thicken into murk as the Doria closed in on the Nantucket Lightship some 160 miles ahead. When Calamai issued general orders for fog precautions, his officers knew exactly what was expected of them.
As the Doria was coming in, Calamai was very cognizant of the fog. He had the foghorns going on. He had dropped and reduced speed. He had the watches all set. He had closed the watertight doors. He had done all the things he needed to do to have the ship come in and try to be safe.
The fog was very heavy, and it's actually so heavy that you couldn't see more than 100 feet, I would say, down the deck. It's the heaviest fog I've ever been in.
I put my hand in front of my face, you know, and I couldn't see it.
One of the Doria's 2 radars was set on the 20-mile range. The fog whistle began to boom warnings at 100-second intervals. Calamai also phoned the engine room, instructing them to reduce the ship speed by a little more than 1 knot. All of these were simply routine procedures, and Calamai fully expected to pass the Nantucket Lightship later that night before heading towards New York City. Traditionally, the final night at sea on a luxury liner is her passengers' last chance to cut loose and celebrate. With most of the packing complete, their final evening is filled with dining, dancing, and music. Orchestras tuned up in the various social rooms, and the wine and drinks flowed with abundance. Unlike many of their fellow passengers, David and Louise Hollier decided to take it easy on their last night at sea. After all, they would be arriving in New York very early in the morning.
So we had our regular dinner, and then we walked around the deck one more time.
While the Holliers finished up some last-minute packing and retired for the night, Liliana Duna found a babysitter for her daughter, slipped into her best evening dress, and went upstairs to join the festivities for the tourist class passengers.
When I went out to the party not even started. I felt very sick in my stomach. I felt shaky. I felt uneasy.
In another part of the ship, a dining room had been converted into a movie theatre, where 9-year-old Pat Mustin-Kohler and his mother watched the evening's film selection. Pat's younger sister had already retired to their cabin downstairs.
The movie was Foxfire, and it was a romantic movie. And I became very bored with this, you know. So I got up, I walked behind the screen, and now the movie was turned around. And our waiter was standing next to me, and we were chatting.
Meanwhile, on the bridge, Captain Calamai and his officers monitored the ship's progress in the fog, as well as the whereabouts of other ships in the area. As the Andrea Doria approached the Nantucket lightship, Calamai kept a close watch on the radar screens. Fog was commonplace off the Nantucket shoals, and the captain had navigated in similar conditions hundreds of times in the past. But the Andrea Doria was entering some of the most heavily traveled shipping lanes in the world. The famous gateway to New York and the New England coast nicknamed Times Square by the mariners who navigated them. The continuous traffic in the area made it a notorious danger zone. But Doria was still clipping forward at a brisk speed of 22 knots.
All ships were at excessive speed in fog, and they had to monitor their radar carefully in order to meet their schedules. If they slowed down every time they encountered fog, they'd soon be fired as captain. They had ETAs, estimated time of arrivals, at various ports, and they had to maintain those ETAs.
Approaching the Nantucket lightship from the opposite direction, the Swedish-American line Stockholm had departed New York just that morning and was moving ahead at a steady 18.5 knots. On the Stockholm's bridge, Captain Gunnar Nordensen completed his final check just after 9:45 p.m. Satisfied that everything was in order, he turned command over to Ernst Carstens Johansson, his young third officer. Carstens had only been aboard the Stockholm for 2 months and was eager to prove to his meticulous and demanding captain that he was worthy of the responsibilities given him. Nordensen's last orders before retiring for the night were to notify him immediately in the event of fog or upon sighting of the Nantucket lightship. At 10:10 p.m., the Andrea Doria passed the Nantucket lightship. She was still enveloped by a thick veil of fog and was only able to see the lightship as a tiny pip on her radar screen. Approximately 30 minutes after passing the lightship, the westbound Andrea Doria encountered a different pip on her radar screen. That pip was the Stockholm.
She had picked up the pip of the Stockholm 17 miles away. They concluded that it was a safe right-to-right or starboard-to-starboard meeting situation. They carefully watched the pip of the Stockholm. Of course, it was foggy. They couldn't see it visually. And then they decided to alter course to their left to open up the distance starboard-to-starboard.
The sole officer on the bridge of the Stockholm, Carstens monitored his radar as well in between juggling other duties. He first noticed the pip of the Andrea Doria at a distance he calculated to be 12 miles. As the two mammoth liners closed on each other, Carstens ordered the Stockholm's course altered to starboard, an order that would have disastrous consequences. Carstens believed he had plenty of time to maneuver away from the oncoming vessel. But in reality, the 29,100-ton Andrea Doria was barreling towards him, a mere 4 miles away. At 10:55 p.m. On board the bridge of the Andrea Doria, Captain Calamai and his officers were beginning to become concerned. Not only was the oncoming Stockholm on a parallel course with their vessel, but she still hadn't sounded her foghorn or given any indication that she was aware of the massive passenger liner fast approaching from the east. Ship-to-ship VHF radio communication wasn't available in 1956, so Calamai had only his instincts to rely upon when predicting what the other ship would do.
Why doesn't she whistle? She should whistle.
Despite these increasingly ominous signs, Captain Calamai still believed that the Andrea Doria would execute a safe starboard-to-starboard passing with the still unidentified Pip on her radar screen.
Tutta sinistra! Tutta sinistra!
Confident in the maneuverability of his vessel, Calamai decided against the customary rules of the road and ordered the Doria's course change to port rather than starboard. That final left turn couldn't have been more ill-timed. At 11:09 p.m., the blanketing fog that had covered the Doria suddenly parted like a hazy curtain. For a fraction of a second, Calamai and his crew began to feel hopeful, but their relief turned to horror when they recognized the outline of the Stockholm steaming towards them at 18.5 knots. On board the Stockholm, Third Officer Carstens caught his breath when he saw the broadside of the Andrea Doria emerge from a fog bank less than a mile from his starboard bow. There was barely a moment to react. On both bridges, the commanders ordered last-minute evasive maneuvers. Carstens threw the Stockholm's engines into reverse.
Pull back, alla maskiner!
It was much too late. At 11:10 p.m., the bridge officers watched helplessly as the ice-cutting steel reinforced bow of the Stockholm sliced through the Andrea Doria's starboard side, just beneath her bridge wing.
As the ships came in at such an angle, it pivoted like a can opener and blew through 3 watertight compartments. The Stockholm's bow was essentially snapped off in the side of the Doria.
From his position behind the movie screen in the Doria's tourist-class dining room, 9-year-old Pat Mastrinkola was knocked to the floor upon impact.
And it sounded like an avalanche. Then a projector went over, the screen went over, and all of a sudden the ship tipped, and everyone started to slide towards the starboard wall. So I crawled up there, and I heard my mother say, "My baby, my baby." I said, "Mom, I'm all right." She says, "No, not you. Your sister went down to the cabin." So I started to go out of the dining room to go down and get my sister. I could hear people on B deck screaming, and, I could still hear those screams.
Respecting her foreboding premonitions, Liliana Duna had left the party upstairs and set out to check on her daughter.
I just made to open the door, that's when the collision happened. It happened so fast. One of the big class, they are, nailed to the wall, they fall down, right across from me and my daughter.
During the first 30 seconds that it took for the 2 giant ships to collide and separate, 48 people died. Many of them Italian immigrants who were sleeping in their cabins on sea deck, anticipating the new life that awaited them in New York. 13-year-old Linda Morgan was sleeping in her first-class cabin with her sister when the collision occurred, and was miraculously swept up by the bow of the Stockholm and thrown onto its deck. Linda was discovered lying in her pajamas by the Stockholm's damage control team. Her sister and stepfather were killed instantly. Had Pat Mastrinkola's family not changed cabins on their return trip, they would have suffered the same fate.
The cabin we had going to Italy was cabin 670, and they gave us a cabin all the way on C deck, which was the very bottom of the ship. There were 4 college girls in that cabin on a return trip. They were killed immediately when the 2 ships collided. That entire area, those entire 26 cabins were immediately crushed and flooded.
On board the Stockholm, passengers were shaken but uninjured. But in the crew cabins underneath the forward bow, the situation was grim. William Johnson had been in one of those cabins practicing his Swedish with his cabin mate.
I was sitting in the other part of the cabin away from him. Then, sometime after 11, the collision occurred. There was a deafening roar, the lights went out, the ceiling came down, there was a crumble of everything in the room, and I went unconscious.
Johnson's cabin mate was one of 5 Stockholm crewmen killed by the impact. Meanwhile, the mortally wounded Andrea Doria was already listing 18 degrees to starboard, and her startled survivors were beginning to panic. Running through the corridors in search of his sister, Pat Mastrinkola witnessed firsthand the chaos that had taken hold of the ship.
I went down to A deck, and it was a narrow corridor, and that corridor was completely filled with smoke. And these people were coming out. You know, they were coming out in night clothes and screaming and yelling. And every time I would try to go in this corridor, I would get hit by an adult.
He said, "We've got to get out of here." And I said, "I'm not going anywhere dressed like this." And we couldn't open the closet door where we had our clothes because it had racked. In fact, he couldn't open the door to our cabin. So he struggled with that. And he said, "Take my suit," which was hanging on a hanger on the door. So I grabbed that, and he worked on the door until he finally got it open.
We both had the presence of mind to put on our life jackets.
Oh,
we did.
You had the presence of mind.
And we said, now we've got to get topside as rapidly as possible.
I can't stand up, and I can't get to my daughter. With a lot of confusion in my mind, I got my daughter's leg, but she was sleeping, and she woke up by then, and I got her. In the meantime, people passing me, screaming, people there on the floor. We was trapped. We see the door, but we can go up to the door, and we screaming. Still, I don't know what happened in the ship. If it was sinking, we scream, and some men, a couple of men, I guess, they stopped, and they made a human chain.
Liliana Duna, Pat Mastrinkola, and the Holliers somehow completed the treacherous climb to the high side of the ship. They arrived to a harrowing sight. Hundreds of passengers awaiting official instructions, which were garbled if they came at all. They were huddled in small groups on the upper decks, terrified and uncertain of what had actually happened. Amongst the crowd, speculation ran wild.
I said we ran up into a sandbar.
But we were, of course, far enough outshore, so we shouldn't have done that. We said, well, maybe we didn't think of colliding with another ship. What we thought is maybe an engine room explosion, maybe a floating mine. That was came to mind.
And we had no idea what had happened to us, no idea whatsoever. And the fog was so thick that it muffled any noise from the rest of the ship. It was as if we were all alone up there, this group of maybe 100 of us, all by ourselves in the world.
Amidst the turmoil on deck, the crew of the Doria began assessing the damage and struggling in vain to correct the ship's list. Captain Calamai ordered all crew members, including Second Officer Guido Badano, to their emergency stations.
I reached the bridge after 2 or 3 minutes. I gave the order to send the SOS. That was at 10 minutes after the collision. I helped to make the position, and I sent on the station.
Once Second Officer Badano had determined the Doria's exact position, he passed it along to Captain Calamai, who ordered the radio men to send the SOS. That SOS would set in motion the most extensive sea rescue operation in peacetime history. On duty for his watch at Coast Guard headquarters in New York City, Lieutenant Harold Parker Jr. heard the SOS broadcasts from both ships.
A message came in that obviously was from a Swedish ship because it started with an S, and it said, "Ship in collision, please indicate." And shortly after that, another message came in, and that was SOS, coming in the same way. When they came and they said, "It's the Andrea Doria," I knew we had a big case on our hands at that point.
On the dramatically slanting decks, some passengers, too, began to realize what had happened.
Someone came along with a radio.
So he turned it on to a New York station, and they were describing what had happened. They said the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm collided about 45 miles off Nantucket.
On board the Andrea Doria, confusion turned to abject terror as passengers realized the magnitude of the disaster. Arriving at the portside lifeboats, they were horrified to find every one of the crafts totally inoperable due to the wounded vessel's 25-degree list.
I was in charge to lower the boat on the port side of the vessel, and this was not possible to do.
The lifeboats on the upper side simply wouldn't come down. They were gravity lifeboats, and gravity didn't work when they were tipping like that. The other side, you could use them, but they didn't even lower them.
Now, with lifeboat capacity for little more than half the people on board her, the stricken Doria's list grew more dramatic by the minute.
This was now when the terror started to set in. The ship now is listing severely. We're up on the high side of the ship. There's nowhere to go.
With no other means of getting off the ship, survivors had little choice but to forge their way back down to the Doria's starboard side, where crew members were attempting to launch the 8 operable lifeboats. Finally, a vision of hope appeared from behind the wall of fog. The tiny freighter Cape Ann, the first rescue boat on the scene. A half-mile away, the Cape Ann's Captain Boyd watched with horror as people crawled madly about the decks of the dramatically canted Andrea Doria.
The Cape Ann captain had sent word to the vessels that he was proceeding, and Captain Calamai said, "We need boats. How many boats do you have?" And the Cape Ann captain came back through his radio man and said, 2. And that was rather disheartening at that point.
And I said, this is it. There is nowhere to go. We're not getting off. We are dead. And I could not believe that at 9, this was it. And my biggest concern, I started thinking my mother and my sister dead. And this really bothered me to no end. This was sheer terror. Those 3 hours, I'm guessing 3 hours, it was somewhere in that neighborhood, was the most terrifying 3 hours I ever spent in my life.
We was in a spot, you know, look like a God forgot about us.
At 1:45 a.m., July the 26th, 1956. Almost 3 hours had passed since the collision of the Stockholm and the Andrea Doria, and still only a handful of the nearly 1,700 people aboard the sinking ship had been evacuated. Barely an hour earlier, Captain Nordenson of the Stockholm had completed his damage assessment, and determining his ship to be out of immediate danger, gave the order to allow Doria survivors on board.
He instilled confidence in the passengers when he said that the Stockholm was not going to sink. I mean, I wasn't absolutely sure that he knew that, but he did say that on the public address system, and I think we had some assurance that we were not going to go down.
Meanwhile, the Coast Guard and a few small rescue ships began to arrive at the wreck site, but none of these vessels had anywhere near the capacity required to take on the enormous mass of survivors, many injured, who waited in terror aboard the listing liner's decks.
Every time the ship made any kind of a noise, people would start screaming, thinking that at this point it's going to now turn over. Because this ship had listed so badly immediately that the fear of capsizing was immense. So any noise that the ship made, it looked like this was it, now it's going over, and people would start to panic. I can remember my mother yelling at a woman who was beginning to lose it. She said, you know, calm down, I have my children here and you're scaring them.
"44 miles east of the wreck, Captain Raoul de Baudin of the superliner Ile-de-France monitored his radio closely. Eastbound, and nearly 2 hours past the Nantucket lightship, de Baudin had first picked up the Doria's SOS at 11:30 p.m., but had continued on, hearing that several rescue ships were already racing to the scene. But at 11:54, when de Baudin learned that no passengers had yet left the Doria, he made a selfless decision. He radioed that he was turning his ship around. For 2 hours, the giant liner raced through the fog, her captain anxious to arrive in time to rescue the stranded passengers.
When the Ile-de-France pulled in, the fog had just started to break. It was like a curtain opening in a theater. And all you saw was these gigantic block letters, Ile-de-France.
There it was, just beautiful. You can imagine how it made the people who were there up to their knees in water and things like this.
People on the ship went crazy. They clapped, they cheered, because they said, now we're back in a race.
Now, hundreds of passengers scrambled to board the Ile-de-France lifeboats as the Andrea Doria tipped even further onto her wounded starboard side.
We decided when the worst came to worst that we would get up on that railing and hold hands and jump together. The one fear that I had in all this time was that we would ever be separated. And we figured if we held on to each other and jumped together, at least we should come down at the ocean together.
My mother said to the French crew member that was rowing, she says, oh, thank God we're saved. And a French crew member looked at her and said, ma'am, if that ship rolls over, we're done.
While Pat and his family rowed away from the ship, Liliana Duna was still stranded on a forgotten part of the deck. She watched in alarm as lifeboat after lifeboat passed her by with no sign of rescue, and knew she had to do something to call attention to her daughter and herself.
I asked one of the survivors, one of the person on the ship, please help me to put a rope around my daughter.
Liliana dangled her little girl over the railing, and as she'd hoped, a lifeboat began to row back towards them. But before it reached the ship, the rope slipped and her daughter fell.
I don't know what to do. I take this jacket off and I go in top of the banister to jump in. And I try to fall right where my daughter is. And I did. And I stay in the water and I try to swim with my daughter to the boat, and the boat come to me and it got me.
In these never-before-seen home movies, Peter de Brockie, a sailor on the naval vessel Private William H. Thomas, captured the action as a steady stream of passengers were evacuated from the Andrea Doria over the next 2 hours. By 5 a.m., nearly all of the survivors had been rescued. Even with a list of 40 degrees, the massive liner maintained a sad, lingering beauty. Now, the only people remaining on board the Andrea Doria were Captain Calamai and 11 of his officers. The veteran seaman seemed to have aged years since the collision hours before, and steadfastly refused to leave his doomed vessel. Finally, the grief-stricken Calamai acquiesced to his men's wishes, and by 5:30 a.m. the Andrea Doria, pride of post-war Italy, lay abandoned. Of the 1,706 passengers and crew aboard the Andrea Doria, 1,662 were rescued. Before they could finish their journey to New York, however, the Andrea Doria had one last memory with which to leave them. At 10:10 a.m., she rolled onto her starboard side with a last creak and sigh that jarred the silence of the misty Cape Cod morning.
We knew it was doomed. We could see it was doomed. There was no way to save it. And it just continued to turn, and when it was horizontal, then all of a sudden, it tipped up with the prow down and just gently slid beneath the waves.
I could see crew members throwing keys over and crying. You know, these were all Italians, so they were very emotional.
And was very, very sad. Well, many people cried, myself, of course. It was like when you lose a friend, young, nice. Anyway.
I never believed I was going to get to New York. Even in the boat over there, it was in real till we see the Statue of the Liberty coming in. That's when people start broke down. I see all of the men cry. It was very emotional.
The crew and passengers of the Andrea Doria limped into New York aboard the Ile-de-France, Cape Ann, and the badly damaged Stockholm. Anxious families lined the streets along the waterfront, and hungry reporters pressed amongst them, hoping to catch a glimpse of the survivors of one of the worst peacetime sea disasters since the Titanic in 1912.
It's going to be an emotional moment on something like that. I mean, the men are crying, hugging, kissing. My aunts were there, my father. That was the only time I'd ever seen my father cry. I mean, he was so relieved to see us. To a small boy, this was just incredible. All the ambulances, the police, the stretchers. It was an incredible sight.
The tension moved from the high seas to the courtroom in September of 1956. Youthful Officer Carstens, stoic Captain Nordenson, and solemn Captain Calamai became the reluctant players in a drama which threatened to destroy the reputations of men who had devoted their lives to the sea. Initially, Captain Calamai received the lion's share of blame for his failure to reduce speed and his unorthodox decision to attempt an evasive turn to port. Years later, Third Officer Carsten's faulty reading of the mile range of his radar seemed to many mariners a more plausible explanation. But since the Doria's instruments and logs lay on the ocean bed off the coast of Nantucket, no one would leave the New York hearings with a satisfactory answer. In January 1957, the case was settled out of court by Lloyd's of London, who represented both shipping lines. Thus, with the closing of a checkbook, one of the great maritime tragedies of the 20th century came to an end. The case of the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm was never reopened. Captain Nordenson and Third Officer Carstens Johansson continued sailing with the Swedish line. The Stockholm's bow was repaired at a cost of $1 million, and she still sails the world to this day. Permanently scarred and saddened by the loss of the Andrea Doria, Captain Calamai retired to Genoa. When asked why he never sailed again, he would say, "When I was a boy and all my life I loved the sea. Now I hate it." As for the Andrea Doria, her rusty barnacle-covered remains lie in darkened solitude off the coast of Nantucket. In life, she was the most celebrated ocean liner of her day. In death, she's a solemn reminder of the ultimate fallibility of even the most impressive of man's achievements, and of the ever-present danger beneath the calmest ocean waves.